This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 18th chapter. Peter came and said to Jesus, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seized him by the throat. He said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then the fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to the Lord all that had taken place. Then the Lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay the entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please. God's grace, mercy, and peace be yours this day, through Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. How often do we have to forgive? It's not easy. It's not an easy question. But it is a core part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. How often should I forgive? Joan had always been really competitive with her 2 sisters, and it started in an early age. The parents didn't help with comments like, "Boy, it sure would be nice if we had 3 girls on the softball team." So, of course, the other 2 sisters joined the softball team, but wouldn't you know it, that's not good enough either. Nothing's good enough for Mom and Dad. "Boy, it sure would be nice if the other 2 were half as good as Judy is." Comments like that constantly. So they were always being competitive, always figuring out who could run faster or get better grades on a particular test. Always competing. Now that they were older, Joan hoped that they could really get this immature attitude behind them. They were grown-ups now. They didn't have to worry about Mom and Dad's rude comments that way. But when her youngest daughter, Christy, came to her in tears at the family reunion, saying that Aunt Judy and Aunt Jane were teasing her that she wasn't as good at catching the Frisbee as her older cousins, well, that was it. They were several years older. She said, they told me I should go home. Can we go home, Mommy? Feelings like that, with a little girl feeling hurt by her own aunts. How often should we forgive? How do you handle those kind of situations? How do you get beyond rude, hurtful comments like that? How often? Albert knew that he was getting the promotion. He worked really hard the past couple of months, and the business was doing really well, particularly because of the new clients that Albert brought in. He knew there was a promotion coming, and so he played it cool when the owners of the business called a meeting and asked him to join them. They sat him down and said, "Albert, we really appreciate all that you've been doing here, all the hard work that you've put in. You've become the real backbone of this company. That's why we'd like you to train the new manager." Whatever they said after that, Albert couldn't hear anything. Train the new manager? But that's my job. How often should I forgive? How do we find that place in ourselves where we can let go of those hurts, where we can get past those tensions, where we can find some peace with one another, where we can find some peace with our sense of what we deserve? Time and again we face these circumstances and we have to ask that question. How often? Before we get too far, we need to remember what this text was originally addressing. It was not it was not the crowds that Jesus was addressing that day. It was Peter, one of the closest disciples, one of his most faithful followers, who came to him personally and said, Lord, how often should we forgive? Now, there were rules about forgiveness. The Jews had a sense of forgiveness too. Christians don't have the corner market on a value like that. But he thought 7 was a pretty generous number. I have to forgive 7 times. And really, this isn't an issue about sin and acceptability before God. It wasn't an issue of faith and being a faithful follower. It was a question about community. Last week we heard a lesson about community too. What do you do when somebody has upset you, somebody has offended you? And I mentioned that the Greek word there is not actually sin. Our English translation uses the word sin, but it's not the greatest translation. The word is actually offense. It's not a spiritual matter. It's about figuring out how to be in relationship with each other. And every relationship is going to have a point where they find some tensions, where we disagree with one another. And the question is how we deal with that. Are those disagreements, are those tensions going to be the last word? Are they going to define the future of the relationship? Are they going to shape your interaction with each other from there on? Or can we find a way to get beyond them? Jesus gives us very specific instruction. Last week he said, if somebody's upset you, if they've offended you, go and talk to them. Because the tendency is exactly the opposite. The tendency is to talk to other people. Do you know what they said to me? Do you know what they did? I can't believe they said that to me. Go and talk to the individual. And try, not with the goal of shaming them, not with the goal of blasting them, not with the goal of vanquishing your enemies. Because I think we all know what revenge, the temptation that way. But with the goal of restoring relationship, of coming to an understanding, figuring out how to work together. Because Jesus says that is what's most important here. And this is all in the context of the fact that Jesus has said he's going to be returning to heaven. He's not going to be leading them anymore personally in a physical, visible kind of way. So they're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other. And he knows that those tensions are coming up, and that's why we have our text for today. About forgiveness. About reconciliation. How often should I forgive? Well, Jesus' answer, if you're keeping score, you're not forgiving. If you're keeping score, you're not really forgiving. Paul echoes that in 1 Corinthians, that section that's known as the love chapter. 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love is not. Love keeps no record of wrongs. How often should I forgive? You don't count. You just forgive. Because that's what God does with us. God is not counting our mistakes, our faults, our missteps. God is loving and forgiving. Don't count, just forgive. It's a lesson of how to be the church, how to be the people of God, but I've got how to be a community here of faith, of the faithful followers. That's the original context. It was Peter and Jesus. Jesus was talking to the disciples about being disciples, but I've got to wonder, does that same value of reconciliation not apply to other areas outside the faith community? Is this value of reconciliation not also appropriate in our homes, in our workplace? And those same questions apply. How often should I forgive? I think every last one of us here has struggled with that question at one time or another. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy question to work with. And I think sometimes the most difficult, the most challenging people to forgive are those who are closest to us. Family ties. My husband Gary and I were flying to Hawaii from New York City to show our 5-month-old son Timmy to my parents for the first time. But what should have been a mission of joy filled me with apprehension. For 5 years I'd hardly spoken to my father. Loving but stern, in the manner typical of Chinese fathers, he had made particular demands on me, and though we were very much alike, we'd grown very far apart. When I became a teenager, my father held up my mother as a model of feminine behavior. But she was gregarious and social, while I preferred books to parties. He pressed me to mingle with his friends' children, and I insisted on choosing my own companions. He assumed I'd follow in my mother's footsteps and enroll in the local university to study teaching. and that I'd marry into one of the other long-established Chinese clans on the island and settle down as he and my mother had. But I didn't settle. As bullheaded as my father, I escaped to the University of California, where I fell in love with a haole, as we called Caucasians from the mainland. Gary had blue haole eyes and sandy haole hair. I announced that we were getting married in Berkeley, not Hawaii. No huge, clamorous clan wedding for me. My parents came and met Gary just 2 days before our small, simple wedding. And afterwards we moved to New York, as far from the islands as we could get without leaving American soil. My father's subsequent silence resonated with disapproval. He didn't visit, and neither did I. When my mother telephoned, he never asked to speak to me, and I never asked for him. We might have gone on like this, the habit of separation hardening into a permanent estrangement. But then Timmy was born, and I felt this unexpected tidal pull back to the islands. On the long flight to Hawaii, memories of my childhood, when I was my father's small shadow, came flooding back. I was 3 years old, running behind him as we walked between the banana trees in the plantation town where he taught high school. When I grew tired, he carried me on his shoulders. And I felt like from there I could see forever. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. He would sing, you make me happy when skies are gray. I laughed, taking his devotion as my due. Now the prodigal daughter was returning with the firstborn of the next generation, a hazel-eyed, golden-skinned, half-Baha'i, half-white child who looked little like his Chinese ancestors. How would my father react? If he disapproved of Timmy as he had of me, the breach between us would be complete. I would never return. The plane landed, and I gratefully placed a crying, hungry Timmy into my mother's eager arms. Now, here was an instant and unconditional acceptance of a child by his grandmother. My father's expression was passive and hard to read. He greeted us politely. Good trip? Then he peered cautiously at Timmy, who promptly began to shriek. My father stepped back in alarm. Did he find it unsettling that this squalling stranger might be his own flesh and blood? After dinner at my parents' house, Gary and I retired to my old bedroom. My mother tucked Timmy into a borrowed crib in a room down the hall. 4 hours later, mother instinct pulled me from my sleep. This was the time Timmy usually woke for a bottle. But there were no cries of hunger, no fretful wails. Instead, I heard only the sweet, soft gurgle of baby laughter. And I tiptoed down the hall. In the living room, Timmy lay on a pillow on the floor in a circle of light, his plump, tiny fists and feet churning gleefully. He studied the face bent over him, an Asian face, burned dark by the Hawaiian sun, with laugh wrinkles at the corners of the eyes. My father was giving Timmy a bottle, tickling his tummy, and crooning softly. You are my sunshine, my sunshine. I watched from the darkness, not wanting to break the spell, then crept back to my room. It was then that I began to suspect that my father had wanted to mend the breach as much as I had. Awkward and proud, he hadn't known how, and neither had I. Timmy became the bridge over which we could reach for each other. For the rest of our stay, the tension slowly melted. My father and I didn't discuss our rift directly. Thanks to Timmy, we didn't need to. Having claimed his Hapahauli grandson, my father no longer defined our family by a uniform set of features. Curly-haired, hazel-eyed Timmy was loved for himself. We returned to the islands the following summer. Timmy, now a toddler, splashed in the surf with his grandfather. The summer after that, they built a tree house out of scrap lumber. They painted it blue. So pleased was my father with his new grandfather status that he took early retirement when Timmy was 4 to spend more time visiting his New York family. My son and my father made a handsome pair as they walked together, the Chinese grandfather happily trailed by a different bouncing shadow. often should we forgive? Don't count the number of times. Just forgive. How do we find that place where we can get beyond our differences and our tensions? You figure out whatever it takes. You remember what brought you together in the first place. You remember what's most important to you both. The relationship between you. How often must I forgive?